was in one way very beautiful, a very beautiful thing to see a man charge a security checkpoint armed with multiple weapons, and he was taken down by some very brave members of Secret Service, and they
at a high rate of speed by running. And if you see in the video, the officer in uniform down towards the left of the screen, he sees him running and he's the first to draw his pistol. And it looks like
President Trump just posted what appears to be the first surveillance video of the shooting incident at the White House Correspondents' Dinner. In the video, you can see a man.
The first man they arrested wasn't the man they were hunting. By the time the smoke cleared near the White House perimeter on April 4th, the cameras had already chosen their villain.
A shooter, a street, a few seconds of chaos, a fast headline, case closed.
But inside the command post, nobody was acting like it was over. Because the rounds fired that afternoon didn't match the weapon they recovered. Because one witness swore there were two movements, not one. And because buried inside the panic was a detail so small most people missed it completely. Someone had disabled a traffic camera exactly 90 seconds before the shots. What looked like a violent outburst was starting to feel like a dry run, a signal, or something even worse. And when federal agents, local law enforcement, and National Guard units finally moved on the man they believed was behind it all, they weren't raiding a hideout. They were walking into a system. At first, the public version sounded simple. Just after midday on April 4th, shots erupted near a restricted corridor not far from the White House. Pedestrians dropped.
Agents moved.
National Guard members on visibility patrol locked the block down within seconds. Sirens stacked from every direction. Metropolitan Police flooded the intersection. Secret Service snapped the outer perimeter shut. By the end of the hour, one gunman was in custody, one weapon had been recovered, and television anchors were already framing it as a lone, unstable actor who had tried to turn the Capitol into a headline. That should have been the end of it. But inside the FBI's Washington field office, analysts reviewing the first wave of evidence hit a wall almost immediately. The shell casings at the scene suggested a firing sequence that didn't line up cleanly with the suspect's weapon. A forensic tech flagged residue on a concrete barrier 23 feet away from the main impact line, as if a second shooter position had been tested or staged. Then another team found that one nearby camera feed had not failed naturally. It had been interrupted manually.
Not smashed, not shot, interrupted.
Someone with access, or someone who knew exactly how to mimic access. That shifted the question. It was no longer who fired. It was who built the opening. By that night, the investigation had split into two tracks. The first track was public, loud, visible. Interview the captured shooter. Retrace his movements.
Run the gun.
Release controlled details. Let the country think law enforcement had the situation contained. The second track was silent. FBI counterterror teams began pulling phone dumps from towers surrounding 17th and I. The ATF traced purchase chains. DHS analysts mapped transit movement in and out of downtown corridors. The Secret Service reran every maintenance log tied to cameras, badge readers, and traffic control access around the route. And National Guard Command quietly turned over patrol timing records to see whether anyone could have predicted exactly where those soldiers would be standing when the first shot broke. That was the first anomaly that made experienced investigators stop talking and start staring at the wall. The shooter had arrived too clean.
No hesitation.
No wandering. No visible searching. He came in on foot from a path that avoided heavier camera clusters, crossed into a narrow band of limited visibility, and fired toward an area where uniformed presence was guaranteed.
Not random. Not frantic. Directed.
And then they found the burner phone. It was crushed in a storm drain 2 blocks south, but not crushed enough. The SIM card was damaged, not dead. Lab techs rebuilt enough of it to recover fragments of 3 messages.
2 were junk. 1 was a sentence.
If the uniforms pivot east, hold until blue van clears. That one line changed everything. Because that meant coordination. And because no lone actor texts instructions to himself. By the third day, the name that began surfacing in side channels was Evan Rake.
Not in police databases. Not on a watch list.
Not in any official briefing. His name surfaced the way dangerous names often do, indirectly, half-hidden, attached to people who suddenly went quiet. A storage rental in Alexandria linked to a Shell LLC. A prepaid card used near Union Station. A vehicle transfer signed by a man whose ID photo matched nobody. And hovering around all of it was the same pattern. Temporary assets, rotating devices, just enough money to move, never enough to glow. Rake wasn't flashy. That bothered the Bureau more.
Flashy men get noticed.
Organizers don't. So they built his shape before they built his face. Mid-30s to early 40s. Operationally disciplined. Familiar with camera blind spots. Likely military adjacent, maybe security contracting, maybe logistics. Comfortable using people who were disposable. Patient enough to sit behind noise and let someone else take the fall first. and then a woman in Prince George's County blew the case wider open without realizing it.
Her name was Lena Torres, 32.
Night shift respiratory therapist. No criminal record.
No political ties.
She wasn't looking for federal agents, and she definitely wasn't trying to get involved in a White House perimeter shooting. She just wanted her brother to answer his phone. Instead, she found his apartment half empty. The mattress was gone. The drawers were stripped. Kitchen trash bags had been tied off and removed. But one thing remained, a shipping box tucked behind the radiator, crushed in a way that suggested it had been missed during a fast cleanup.
Inside was foam.
Inside the foam was a molded cavity for optics equipment. And under that foam was a receipt stub from a cash warehouse in Chantilly, dated 48 hours before the April 4th shooting. Lena called local police because she thought maybe her brother had gotten mixed up in stolen gear. By sunset, the FBI was knocking on her door. Her brother, Mateo Torres, had no prior history that would put him anywhere near this kind of investigation. He drove contract deliveries, picked up side work, stayed mostly invisible. But invisible people are useful to organized operators.
They don't set off alarms. They rent vans.
They carry packages. They don't ask what's inside if the cash is fast enough. Under questioning, Lena gave agents the detail that broke open the next layer. Mateo had recently started working for a transport company that never used the same office twice. He'd mentioned a supervisor everyone called Rake, never Mr. Anything, never a first name, just Rake. He said the guy spoke softly, tipped in cash, and had a way of making every job sound temporary even when the routes repeated.
Temporary routes. Repeated movement. Cash.
Rotating spaces. This wasn't ideology first.
It was infrastructure.
Agents pulled toll, plate, and warehouse records tied to Mateo's last 3 weeks. Suddenly the map widened from D.C. into Northern Virginia, Baltimore, and South Central Pennsylvania. Small unit rentals.
Short-term office suites.
Freight lockers opened under inactive business names. Packages moving through legitimate channels with altered manifests. Most of it looked boring.
Office electronics. Event supplies.
Catering equipment. Until labs started opening some of the recovered containers.
Inside one, radio parts.
Inside another, camera bypass tools. Inside another, blank credentials and heat-sealed badge laminates. Now the April 4th shots looked less like the attack.
They looked like the test.
That's when the investigation stopped being a manhunt and became a federal operation. DOJ approved broader warrants. FBI tactical teams coordinated with MPD and federal partners. ICE intelligence units were brought in, not because immigration was the story, but because cross-border identity reuse and document pathways were showing up in the financial trails. DEA financial analysts, who were used to following layered shell transactions and cash routing networks, were tapped for pattern support. Everyone suddenly had a lane. Everyone suddenly had a reason to move faster. And while the public argued over motive, the real pressure point was timing. Because on April 11th, exactly 1 week after the White House shots, Washington was scheduled to host a high-visibility diplomatic event involving foreign delegates, military escorts, and multiple restricted transport corridors. If April 4th had been a rehearsal, April 11th might have been the performance. That possibility changed the posture overnight. Here's the part almost nobody outside the operation knew. At 2:18 a.m. on April 8th, agents entered a rented warehouse bay in Landover expecting paperwork, maybe electronics, maybe another dead end. Instead, one of the entry officers swept his light across a false wall seen behind stacked beverage pallets.
They pried it open.
Behind it sat 2 server racks humming in the dark, battery-backed and heat-dampened, cables running through the concrete like veins. On the center table was a laminated street grid of downtown Washington. Several blocks were circled in red. One route was labeled simply, Shift Window. That was one of the cinematic moments federal investigators talk about years later, because in a single room, the case stopped being theoretical. It became physical. Someone had built a live operational nerve center inside what looked like a dead commercial bay.
Not to rant. Not to posture.
To monitor, adapt, and redirect in real time. And on one of those servers was the name they'd been missing.
Elias Voss. Not Evan Rake.
Rake was the field name. Elias Voss was the real one.
Former compliance consultant.
Short federal subcontract history.
No major flags.
A man who had spent years near systems without ever becoming part of one.
Access adjacent. Process literate.
Exactly the kind of person who learns how institutions breathe, then weaponizes the gaps between breaths. The first photos agents pulled showed him in ordinary places, coffee shops, parking garages, hotel lobbies, loading docks. Never dramatic.
Never armed.
Never meeting the same person twice in the same way. But when analysts overlaid his movement with the shell companies, warehouse rentals, burner phones, and courier routes, his presence kept appearing at the edges like a fingerprint in fog. That would have been enough for a national manhunt. But then came the mid-twist. One of the maintenance override codes used to blank the camera near the April 4th scene didn't originate from an external breach. It had been authenticated through a valid municipal contractor credential. Someone on the inside hadn't just been compromised. Someone on the inside had participated. The investigation turned inward. Not publicly, quietly. Badge logs were rescrubbed. City access vendors were reviewed. Contract chains were pulled. And there, buried under subcontract paperwork so dull nobody would ever voluntarily read it, was a name: Julian Mercer, network maintenance specialist, third-tier contractor, clean background, routine access, forgettable work history. Mercer had never met Voss in any official system, but their phones had crossed paths 6 times in 3 months.
Not calls. Proximity. Parking garage. Roslyn. DuPont.
Alexandria Marina, a diner near New Carrollton, and once, 4:11 minutes, half a mile from the warehouse in Landover. That was the twist investigators hated most. The April 4th shots weren't just enabled by preparation from the outside. They were softened from the inside. Now the story became bigger, darker, and much harder to contain. Because if Voss had one municipal contractor feeding him access windows, how many other low-level insiders had he touched?
Delivery drivers, facility cleaners, IT vendors, security floaters.
Not traders in the cinematic sense.
Just pressured people, paid people.
People too peripheral to be scrutinized, but close enough to open tiny doors. And tiny doors are all a strategist needs. While teams surged on Mercer, another part of the operation chased the money. The numbers were small individually, which was smart. 6,000 here, 4,800 there. Payroll-style disbursements, invoice reimbursements, consulting retainers, peer-to-peer transfers beneath automatic reporting thresholds. But when forensic accountants stacked 6 months of movement across 12 entities, the total crossed $2.8 million. That money hadn't built luxury. It had built silence.
Cheap apartments, fuel, device rotation, storage,
contractor retainers,
legal standby, travel, deniable labor.
Voss wasn't funding an army. He was funding an ecosystem. And ecosystems are harder to kill because they don't collapse when one branch gets cut. Around this point, the human cost came back into view. One story centered on specialist Aaron Bell, a 22-year-old guard member who had been 3 yards from the first crack of gunfire. He wasn't hit, but he saw the concrete spit beside him and turned just in time to watch another uniformed figure drop hard behind a planter. 4 days afterward, according to investigators, Bell replayed one detail over and over. The shooter didn't look enraged.
He looked focused.
Like he was trying to complete a task. That detail mattered. Focused violence scares investigators more than chaotic violence.
Then there
was Lena Torres again, now under protection, carrying the guilt people carry when they think a family tie makes them responsible for someone else's choices. She kept asking agents whether Mateo was evil or just desperate. And nobody gave her a clean answer, because federal cases like this rarely offer clean answers. Mateo hadn't designed the system, but he moved through it.
He made it run.
He delivered the box, signed the rental, drove the van.
At some point, desperation becomes function.
And function becomes damage. By April 9th, Mercer was in custody. He broke faster than agents expected.
Not all at once.
Not in one dramatic confession.
In fragments.
A tired man realizing the architect he served was never going to save him. He admitted he'd provided maintenance windows, temporary camera disruptions, and route alerts. He insisted he never knew the full objective. Investigators only half believed him. Men like Mercer often know more than they say and less than they imagine. But he gave them something priceless.
A location, not Voss's home.
Voss didn't live like that. A fallback site in western Maryland, disguised as a rural equipment yard run through an agricultural supply front. Mercer said Voss used it for offline meetings, when devices were too risky and cities felt too hot. That's where the operation tightened. Federal teams didn't crash it immediately.
They watched.
Drones at range.
Unmarked vehicle.
Pattern logs. 2 days of patient surveillance.
Trucks came and went.
One carried fertilizer bags over an axle sitting too low for its declared load. Another arrived empty and left heavy. A woman posing as a bookseller entered once and left with nothing in her hands. At dusk, a man in work coveralls emerged, stood near a rusted tractor, and scanned the road the way trained people scan roads, not casually, but in slices.
Then, just before dawn on April 10th, they saw him.
Elias Voss stepped out of a gray utility trailer carrying coffee in one hand and a paper folder in the other, like a man beginning an ordinary day. That image alone tells you something about people like him. The calm is part of the machinery. At 5:46 a.m., the green light came. Local law enforcement sealed the outer rural roads. FBI tactical units moved on the core structures. National Guard support units, already positioned because of the wider threat matrix and possible heavy resistance, locked down the perimeter and assisted with containment. One flash diversion hit near the fuel drums. A K-9 team cleared the eastern shed. An armored vehicle rolled up the service lane as commands echoed across the yard. For 7 seconds, nothing moved.
Then a side door burst open.
One man ran toward the tree line and was dropped by a tackle from a county deputy before he made 20 yards. Another tried to torch a stack of paper records in a burn barrel and got pulled backward by 2 agents.
And Voss?
Voss did exactly what men like him do when their design fails. He tried to disappear inside confusion. He ditched the folder, cut behind a feed container, and reached a secondary truck bay where investigators later found a pre-packed exit kit, cash, fake credentials, a satellite communicator, 2 passports, and medication under a false name. He nearly made it to a drainage culvert beyond the fence. But one guard member on overwatch caught the movement.
2 shouted commands. 1 warning burst into the dirt. Voss froze, then dropped to his knees. Just like that, the man behind the April 4th White House shots was in custody. But the final realization came after the arrest. Inside the paper folder Voss dropped were route studies, staffing estimates, and timing grids for more than one event. April 4th had not been the mission. It had been a calibration point, a live field measurement.
He wanted to know response speed, perimeter elasticity, camera substitution lag, media panic velocity, and how fast downtown Washington could be pushed from normal to fragmented. He fired into a secure world not just to wound it. He fired to study it. That is what makes cases like this so disturbing. Not just the violence, the method. Because the real danger wasn't one radical man with a weapon. It was a disciplined operator building a modular network around ordinary friction points, low-level access, temporary workers, weak oversight, deniable payments, forgotten storage units, boring subcontractors. Nothing cinematic on its own. But stack enough forgettable pieces together and you can put the nation's capital under stress with frightening precision. And that's why the capture mattered so much. Not because one man was dangerous. Because one man had proved how much damage could be organized from the margins before anyone called it a system. In the weeks that followed, sealed indictments expanded. More couriers were identified. Financial conduits were frozen. Mercer's cooperation opened side investigations in 3 states. Mateo Torres was later found in Delaware under an assumed name, hiding in a motel where the curtains had been clipped shut with office binders. He was arrested without incident. Several storage sites connected to Voss yielded surveillance hardware, signal tools, uniforms, access cards, and handwritten notes that obsessed over patrol habits the way gamblers obsess over odds. The public got the broad version. The operation got the truth. April 4th was never about one burst of gunfire near the White House. It was about stress testing the people and systems guarding one of the most watched pieces of ground in the world. And if Lina Torres hadn't looked behind that radiator, if one tech hadn't rebuilt that damaged SIM, if one analyst hadn't treated a dead camera like sabotage instead of malfunction, if one guard member hadn't spotted movement near that culvert, this story might have ended very differently. That's the part that stays with you. Huge investigations don't always break because of one massive clue. Sometimes they break because one tiny detail refuses to fit. And once that detail starts pulling on the thread, the whole structure begins to come apart. So when people ask how law enforcement and National Guard units captured the man behind the April 4th White House shots, the answer isn't just force.
It's patience.
It's pattern recognition. It's the decision not to believe the first easy explanation. Because the easiest explanation is usually the safest one to broadcast, and the most dangerous one to trust. If a network can hide inside routine contracts, borrowed identities, and ordinary city movement long enough to probe the White House perimeter, what else could be operating in plain sight before anyone even realizes the first incident wasn't the real event? If you want, I can turn this into a fully formatted YouTube voiceover script with scene cues, thumbnail text ideas, and a high-retention intro/outro package.